Good day everyone. Today I will show you the different projections of the upper extremities. I have here the different sizes of radiographic image receptor. First is the 8x10 IR. Second is the 10x12 image receptor. Third is the 11x14 inches. Fourth is the 14x14 inches. And last but not the least, the 14x17 inches of radiographic image receptor. The first projection that I will show you is the PA projection of my patient's hand. I believe that the suited IR for this projection is the 8x10 size of the radiographic image receptor that we are using inside the laboratory. It is stated that before positioning the patient, we must ensure that there is no any materials that will cause obstruction of the image. As you can see, the patient is seated at the end of the radiographic table or my dummy radiographic table comfortably. Therefore, I will be placing the hand of the patient directly in contact with the IR. The palm of the patient must face the IR and will be flexing her elbow 90 degrees. Her elbow 90 degrees for the patient's comfortability during the procedure. Next, spread the fingers of the patient slightly and the central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the MCP joint. Spread the patient fingers slightly and the central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the third MCP joint. So this meter stick serves as our central ray. This is the patient's third MCP joint. This projection shows the carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, inter-articulations of the hand, and distal radius and ulna. For the lateral projection extension, I will be using the same size of the cassette, which is the 8x10 inches. The patient is still sitting at the end of the radiographic table comfortably with her forearm in contact with table and with her elbow flex about 90 degrees of and the hand in lateral position with her ulnar in contrast or in contact with the IR rather. The thumb must be abducted. The central ray must perpendicularly directed to the second digit to fifth MCP joint of the patient. This is the central ray. This projection shows the anatomy from fingertips to distal radius and ulna. From fingertips to distal radius and ulna. For the lateral projection flexion, I will still use the same size of the image receptor. The patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table comfortably, and her hand placed on the IR with her ulnar aspect down. The patient finger is flexed into natural flex position with her thumb lightly touching the first finger. Flex. Lightly touching the first finger. The central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the MCP joint, entering the MCP joint of the second digit. Get the portion. Ito po yung second digit natin, second MCP joint. Dito po papasok yung central ray. projection shows anatomy of the patient's fingertips to distal radius and ulna. And flex digits, this one. Superimpose distal radius and ulna. And the thumb free of motion and superimposition. For the fan lateral position, ensure that the hand of the patient is positioned into the long axis of the IR. Rotate the hand and wrist into the lateral position. Next, ensure that all digits, including the thumb, are separated and are parallel to the IR, and that the metacarpals of the patient are not rotated but will remain in a lateral position. Make sure that the central ray is perpendicularly directed to the IR, specifically into the second digit MCP joint of the patient. This serves as our central ray. The central ray, as stated, must be perpendicularly directed into the second digit of the MCP joint of the patient's head. This will show the entire hand and wrist. Distal forearm visible. Distal forearm visible. The radius and ulna. The metacarpals are superimposed. These are the metacarpals. The metacarpals are superimposed, same as the distal radius and ulna. For the PA oblique lateral rotation, I will still use 8x10 image receptor or cassette for this projection. The patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table, comfortably but with adjustment of her height to rest the forearm on the table with her hand pronated and her palm resting on the IR. Rotate the patient hand laterally from the pronation until the fingertips touches the IR and form an angle of approximately 45 degrees with the IR plane. Make sure that the central ray is perpendicularly directed to the third MCP joint. So this is our central ray, and this is the third digit, which is where we can find the third MCP joint of her digits per hand. The central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the third MCP joint of the patient. This projection shows the patient anatomy from the fingertips to distal radius and ulna. Minimal overlap of the third, fourth, and fifth metacarpal bodies, and slightly overlap of the metacarpal bases and the heads. And it will also shows the separation of the second and third metacarpals. For this projection, the AP oblique projection or door guard method, or tinatawag din natin siyang ball catcher's position. I will be using the 10x12 image receptor. The patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table with her hands in contact with the IR in half dapat yung pasyente nakaharap siya sa table para ma-position yung dalawang kamay niya in half supinated position ng mas maayos. Rotate. Rotate the patient's hand to a half supinated position or 45 degrees. And the central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the point midway between both hands at the level of the patient's MCP joints. This is the central ray. So, dapat yung central ray daw is perpendicularly directed at the point midway between both hands of the patient's MCP joints. So, dito. This projection is useful for detecting early rheumatoid arthritis. For the AP Burman method, first CMC, let the patient sit at the end of the radiographic table so that the forearm can be adjusted to lie approximately with the long axis of the IR. Hyperextend the hand of the patient and have the patient hold the position with a bandage loop around the digits. While the hand is rotated internally, the thumb must be abducted so that it is flat on the IR. Kesyo wala po tayong bandage loop, kaya ang gagamitin ko po is ID-lace na lang po. So, sabi dyan, the patient hold the position with the bandage loop around the digits. And the hand is rotated internally. The hand is rotated internally. Tapos, yung thumb niya raw is naka-abduct para yung thumb niya is flat sa IR. The central ray must enter to the first CMC joint at a 45 angle toward the elbow. This shows a magnified concavo-convex outline of the first CMC joint. For the PA folio method, first MCP, the patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table comfortably. Place the patient's hand on the cassette, both hands on the cassette, resting them on their medial aspects and tightly wrap a rubber band around the distal portion of both thumbs and place a roll of medical bandage or medical tape between the bodies of the first metacarpals. Pero wala po tayong medical tape, kaya ito na lang po yung gagamitin ko. Ensure that the thumbs remain in PA plane. Ensure that the thumbs remain in PA plane by keeping the thumbnails parallel to the cassette. Before exposure, then hold it. Pull the thumbs apart and then hold. The central ray must be perpendicularly directed to a point midway between both hands at the level of the MCP joints. This projection shows the MCP joints and MCP angle bilaterally. This time, I will be showing you the different projection of my patient's wrist. Still, the patient is seated at the end of the radiographic table comfortably, but have the patient lean laterally to prevent rotation, and her elbow must be extended and hand must be placed in a supine position, and that the patient forearm must rest on the table. And place the image receptor under the wrist and center it to the carpal bones. I am using the 8 by 10 size of the image receptor. And then the central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the mid-carpal area area. This serves as the central ray. This projection will show us the not rotated distal, radius and ulna, carpals, and half of the metacarpals. For the PA projection of the wrist of the patient, the patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table comfortably. Flex the elbow of the patient 90 degrees and then center the image receptor or center the wrist to the center of the image receptor, and then ensure that the longitudinal axis of the hand to your forearm is parallel to the longitudinal axis of the image receptor. Ensure that the hand is positioned in a prone position. And then slightly close the palm of the patient so that the anterior part of the wrist is in contact with the IR. This projection shows the not rotated radius and ulna, carpals, proximal half of metacarpals, and open joint radioulnar space. For the lateral projection of the wrist, the patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table comfortably. And then flex the patient elbow 90 degrees. And then the patient wrist joints must be placed at the center of the IR. Then the longitudinal axis of the wrist of the patient must be parallel to the longitudinal axis of the image receptor. Yung wrist, dapat nakaposition siya laterally, wherein the hand is not rotated. The hand is not rotated and the thumb is abducted. Yung thumb daw is abducted. And then the central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the patient's wrist joints. The central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the wrist joints. This projection shows the superimposed metacarpals and carpal bones, and also shows the distal radius and ulna. For the AP medial rotation or the AP oblique medial rotation, the patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table comfortably. Extend the elbow of the patient extend the elbow of the patient, and the wrist must be placed at the center of the IR. The wrist must be placed at the center of the IR. And that the hand of the patient must be in a supine position. The hand of the patient must be in a supine position, and then rotate the hand of the patient medially approximately 45 degrees. And then your central ray must be perpendicularly directed, entering your mid-carpal area. This projection shows the separation of your patient's pisiform from the adjacent carpal bones and will provide distinct radiograph of the triquetrium and hamate. For the PA oblique lateral rotation of the wrist, the patient is still sitting at the end of the radiographic table comfortably, and the patient elbow must be flexed 90 degrees. The hand of the patient must be in a prone position, and then rotate the hand approximately 45 degrees externally. Dapat daw and then yung wrist din is rotated 45 degrees dapat. The central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the mid-carpal area. PA oblique lateral rotation shows the carpal's lateral side of the wrist, particularly the trapezoid and scaphoid. Forearm projection. For the anteroposterior forearm projection, I will be using the 11 by 14 size of the image receptor, and then the patient is seated close to the radiographic table, but it should be low enough to place the entire limb in the same plane. So, kailangan yung hand ng pasyente is naka-supine position, yung elbow niya naka-extend, hindi naka-flex, so that the epicondyles of humerus are parallel to the image receptor. The central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the midpoint of the forearm or mid-forearm. This projection shows the distal humerus, the radius and the ulna, and the proximal carpal bones. For the lateral projection of my patient forearm, I will still use the 11 by 14 size of the image receptor. As you can see, the patient is still seated close to the radiographic table, low enough para sa humerus, shoulder and elbow is nakalay siya in the same plane. The elbow must be flexed 90 degrees, and the medial aspect of the forearm must be placed against the IR. The central ray of this projection must be perpendicularly directed to the mid-forearm of the patient, or the midpoint forearm of the patient. This projection shows the not completely imposed radius and ulna, but dun lang sa distal area niya. And it also shows the elbow joint and the proximal row of carpal bones. This time, I will show you the different projections of the elbow. First, the AP projection. I will be using the 10 by 12 size of the image receptor. As you can see, the patient is still seated near the radiographic table, but the patient should be low enough. The patient should be low enough in order for her to place her shoulder joint, humerus, and elbow joint in the same plane. Her elbow must be extended. Her hand or the patient's hand must be in a supine position. And of course, the center of the IR rather, must be in or at her elbow joint. And kailangan yung ulo ng pasyente is layo sa table. The central ray of this projection must be perpendicularly directed to the elbow joint. Central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the elbow joint. Ayan. This projection shows us the elbow joint, the distal arm, and proximal forearm, For the next projection of the elbow, the lateral projection, I will still use the same size of the image receptor, the 10 by 12 size or inches. The patient is still seated in or at the end of the radiographic table low enough in order for the patient to place her humerus and elbow joint in the same plane and in contact with the IR. Her elbow must be flexed 90 degrees. Her elbow must be flexed 90 degrees. Her elbow must be flexed 90 degrees and her hand must be in a lateral projection. And of course, the elbow must be at the center of the IR. And the central ray for this projection is perpendicularly directed at the elbow joint of the patient. This projection shows us the superimposed epicondyle of the humerus and the distal arm and proximal forearm of the patient. And for the AP oblique medial rotation, I will still use the same size of the cassette or image receptor, the 10 by 12 image receptor size. As you can see, the patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table low enough, with her arm extended in contact with the IR or in contact with the table. Kapag sinabi po nating AP oblique medial rotation, yung elbow po ng pasyente is rotated siya 45 degrees. Elbow ng pasyente rotated siya 45 degrees. Paano? It is by simply pronating the hand. It is by simply pronating the hand of the patient. And then the central ray for this projection is the central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the elbow joint of the patient. This projection shows us the coronoid process free from superimposition and the radial head. Or this projection shows us the coronoid process free from superimposition of the radial head. For the AP oblique lateral rotation, I will still use the 10 by 12 size of the image receptor. And as you can see, the patient is still seated at the end of the radiographic table low enough. And in order for the patient to extend her arm and in contact with the table or with the IR, the hand of the patient must be rotated 45 degrees laterally or externally. The first and the second digit must touch the table. The central ray for this projection is the central ray must be perpendicularly directed to the patient's elbow joint. This projection shows as the radial head free from superimposition of the coronoid process. So now I will show you the different projection of the humerus. First, the AP projection. As you can see, I use the 14 by 17 size of the image receptor. The patient must be placed in a standing position or in the what we call anatomical position. The arm of the patient must be abducted. The arm of the patient must be abducted. And the IR must be 2 to 3 inches above the relaxed shoulder of the patient. And that the hand are or must be in a supine position. The head must be in a supine position. And then the epicondyles of the patient are parallel to the IR. The epicondyles of the patient are parallel to the IR. The central ray of this projection is perpendicularly directed to the mid-humerus. Mid-humerus. For the lateral projection of the humerus or lateromedial projection, the patient is still placed in standing position or anatomical position, and that the patient's hand must be in a supine position. And the hand of the patient must be rotated internally, and the palm must rest on the hip of the patient. And of course, the IR must be 2 to 3 inches above the relaxed shoulder of the patient. And for this projection, the central ray of this projection must be perpendicularly entering the mid-humerus. For the lateral projection, mediolateral of the humerus of the patient must be must face the IR or dapat nakatalikod siya. And then yung hand ng pasyente must place at the abdomen laterally. And that the IR must be 2.5 inches to the relaxed shoulder of the patient. Relax. Dikit mga po. And that the central ray for this projection must be perpendicularly directed to the mid of the humerus of the patient. For the lateromedial and mediolateral, it shows the superimposed epicondyles and the entire length of the humerus of the patient. So that's all for the projection of the hand, wrist, forearm, elbow, and humerus of the patient. Thank you and God bless.